the Reformation didn't come to Brazil until the 1950s, 60s. And so the Catholic Church was able to maintain their monopoly down in Brazil for hundreds of years after that. And while the churches were being established in Brazil. Baptist Church has been there for over 100 years. We've been over there for, 60 years and such as that. The whole idea, the Protestant movement, did not gain traction. They were there, they were talking about it. When we moved to the Amazon, there was a Christian bookstore. Now, you had to know where it was. There was no sign, okay? And so the point I'm making is that the actual, the Protestant movement didn't gain traction until right around 1975 to 1980 time frame, and we arrived in 1981. And so this was just now there have been people and churches established and all that, but it really didn't gain traction until 1980. Imagine being there for the Reformation. Imagine being there for the euphoria of discovery. For the first time ever in Brazil, people were deciding for themselves what their relationship with God was going to be. For the first time, they were opening their Bibles and reading it. For the first time, they had an option. And to be there and to minister, that's like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. People were so excited. People were discovering, faith for themselves for the first time. I've had people, I'm thinking of a specific lady who came up to me after she did our public class, okay? We would do public classes. We'd have, anything from Jehovah's Witnesses to 14 Shades of Pentecostals to, a handful of, Catholics, in the class, all trying to rip each other's throats out, and I'm here saying, no, we're not ripping people's throats out in here, okay? But the point is the thrill of discovery, the euphoria of discovery. And to be there for that. It was like, awesome. Okay, opportunities here that frankly, I wish I could do it again because I would do it differently. Okay, so now here's the cool thing. That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Or is it? Actually, we left Brazil after our first 10 years. And we ended up, because the Iron Curtain fell and all mission work was going to Eastern Europe for 20 years. And so we decided we'll just roll with that, okay? We wanted to return to Brazil, but nobody wanted to send missionaries to Brazil. Eastern Europe had all the sizzle. And so we ended up going to Estonia, where for the first time in 2 generations, people were allowed to read their Bibles and speak openly about faith again. Because during the Soviet times, you didn't do that. And so we had a second bite at that apple, right? So for the second time, we were, found ourselves in a situation for the first time in the lifetime of these people. They're actually going to open their Bibles and read and decide about faith for themselves. And so, I kind of look at it and I think, man, we have lived like this charmed life, to be able to have, these two totally separate situations for totally 2 different reasons. But in both cases, we were able to help people, if you would, encounter God and come to faith when for generations that has not been an option. And so one of the interesting things about the work in Estonia is, we had believers there. I mean, we had students, and I mean, they believed, as we tend to believe, whatever the government was telling them. I mean, they thought that they were living better than anyone else in the world. And they believed that they had proven 100 times over that God doesn't exist. And so, one particular lady, she was, I was meeting with her a couple times a week. She was a history teacher in Russia, which, by the way, history teachers are the point of the sword. I mean, you stop and think about what's going on in our own educational system right now. History teachers are the point of the sword because they are telling the story, and they had to believe. I mean, because guess what? This guy who was once a hero of the revolution is now on the outs, right? And so now he's, cooling his heels in Siberia, and he's not one of the good guys anymore. And so they had to, and so this was what a history teacher does in that society. They were true believers. So Marina, it's coming. And I told Cheryl, I said, look, I'm going to have to cut Marina loose. I think she just wants to debate. I said, I've got other people who would value this time more, who would get more out of it, who, are going to come to faith Marina just wants a debate. So I went that day, I already told Cheryl, cutting Marina loose today. Oh, you have little faith, right? And so, here I am. I'm already thinking, I've already kind of practiced how we're going to go about this, right? Because we've been meeting now for I don't know how many months. And so we're halfway through with our class, and she stops and she says, do you have any idea how hard this is? I'm thinking, well, did I say something wrong? Look back at what I'm talking about. No, do you know how hard it is to come here every week only to find out that everything you have believed is a complete lie? And here I am sitting there going, I said, oh, Lord. Okay, Lord, I get it, okay. And so Marina didn't get cut that day. But again, and by the way, where do these opportunities exist? On the mission field. And so, we kind of feel like, we have lived in interesting times and been in interesting places right where the gospel was so sorely needed. And so, anyhow, I just thought I would mention that to you, because both in Brazil and Estonia, if you would, for the first time in generations, the gospel was being preached. And I don't know whether you know this or not, but Brazil today is probably the hottest place in all of the world for mission work. Brazilians are sending missionaries to the United States now. Okay? They're sending missionaries here. So just interesting thoughts. So let me just kind of back up a little bit. I mean, I'm just kind of filling in, and I didn't want to mess up Dale's class on the covenant, so I just decided I would do kind of a little something different. But I just want to, as I mentioned, I was going to do a couple classes on spirituality. And last week I mentioned that spirituality isn't necessarily something that we talk a lot about. Okay? Protestants don't talk a lot about it. And again, I literally did not even understand that, had not perceived that until last year. When, as I started working with this seminary down in Brazil, School of Preaching down in Brazil, that, okay, we're going to start with the spirituality of the students. And so, I would say that my background is probably equal to your background in terms of values, ideals, and the thoughts that formed my notions of God. I was raised back in the church in the 70s for the most part. And I'm the typical product of being raised in the church and our training programs. And so, I was raised in the middle of the road Church of Christ, not archly conservative and definitely not progressive, so middle of the road. And I think the only thing that really distinguishes me from, if you would, the average Joe is that I took it all quite seriously. Okay? I mean, my thought was, if I'm going to be a Christian, I want to be a Christian, all the way. Which, in the mind of a kid means I got to preach. And then when you get among preachers, that means you got to be a missionary. And so when you get to the mission field, you're there about 5 years and you realize, what an idiot I was. I could have been a Christian 100% back in the U.S., and I didn't even have to be a preacher. But by now I'm committed, right? So I got to stay the course. And that was the one thing, that was the one caveat about how I viewed faith, is that, I'm going to be all in on this thing, okay? I believed enough of it that, I wasn't going to pay it lip service. And secondly, today, a lot of my thoughts on God have been influenced, as you might expect, by 20 years of mission work. And so, in the church, we generally think in terms of liberal and progressive, and I kind of think we need another category. I think we need a category of traditional and non-traditional, in the sense of, I consider myself a conservative, but not traditional. And that kind of makes sense when you bear in mind that I, have been working in other cultures and situations for an extended period. I've seen church done in different ways. And so, a little bit less traditional, but still, I think conservative. And I'm probably the only one who thinks that anymore. But nonetheless, so I just wanted to share with you a little bit about where I am spiritually. And I was reflecting on that. And I kind of came up with a little list that I thought is, maybe useful, maybe confusing, I don't know. But if we as a church have sometimes been guilty of preaching the church as much as we've preached Christ, okay, I've been there. I've been that guy. I mean, that was the way I grew up. I mean, we preached the church as much as we preached Christ. Okay? If we've been too focused on salvation, I've been that guy. If we've obsessed at salvation, but not so much on the new life that follows, of being alive unto God, Romans chapter 6, I've been that. If we've been long on formulas and short on wonder, just being amazed, standing amazed before God, I've kind of been that guy. If we've equated knowledge to spirituality, I've been guilty of that at one time or another. If we've had a pathological need to be right, to win an argument, okay, I've been that guy. If we've been too rational, if we've kind of wrung out all the mystery of any relationship with God, okay, I probably at times have been a little bit of that guy. If we've wanted to put God in a box, limiting Him, I probably have done that a time or two. If we've been condescending and judgmental toward the faith of others, okay, there's probably been times that I've been there. If we've been maybe a little too smug in our beliefs, okay, been there. If we believe that the success of the kingdom depends upon us, okay, I probably have been that guy. If we believe that we've got God figured out, all right, I've kind of been there a time or two. If we spent more time worrying about the church than praying over the church, okay, I've probably been there. If we built a spiritual identity around a list of doctrinal statements, okay, I've done that for a while. If we've lived maybe a little bit of a superficial spiritual life, there's been a time, maybe a little bit of that guy. If we've been content with so much scholarship, kind of been that guy from time to time. But today, I'm okay, and I think, stand on the cusp of a new version of faith, one that's God-focused, one that hungers for Him, one that's open to that part of God I will never understand, who realizes that what we don't know about God is insanely larger than what we do know about God. Open to the wonder of it all. And so I approach faith now, and I would say, again, as a seeker. Not as one who has arrived, and I kind of have decided to open myself to the things that I've chosen to close myself to. Oh, can't even think about that, you know. And I'm open to be enveloped by the presence of God who defies comprehension. So, I mean, get the idea. God is infinite. How am I supposed to wrap my mind around that? Why and where? How did I ever think I was going to have God figured out when He is infinite and, you know, my frame of reference is anything but? And so today I kind of embrace the wonder of God, and frankly, I'm excited by the prospects of living a relationship with God that's what I hope is, you know, kind of standing on the shoulders of our typical thoughts on God and realizing that God is so much more than what we maybe have allowed Him to be. And so anyway, today I want to share some thoughts on expressions of spirituality. Okay, now we caught up with the slides. There you go. All right. And again, not that we speak a lot about it. And so today I just want to share with you what are the traditional expressions of spirituality that I think have a place in our lives and in our calculations, okay, as we kind of reflect a little bit on God and what God desires in our lives. And so I'll just start with a couple expressions of spirituality. The first couple are silence and solitude. We really don't do well with silence. I mean, you know, the first thing we do probably when we get home is flip the TV on. Not necessarily we're going to watch TV. We just need the noise in the background. Or maybe it's music. Or maybe it's the kids. I don't know. But, you know, silence, you know, isn't necessarily one of our favorite things. And solitude, you know, it took me years to be able to go and have lunch by myself and be okay with that. You know, I go to lunch by myself, and I know everybody's thinking, what a loser. You know, poor guy, he's eating by himself, and they don't know that I'm over there having a party, you know. I finally got comfortable with solitude. And the point I want to make is that, you know, this is a discipline that has long been recognized as an essential part of spirituality as we isolate ourselves from God and the world's concerns and the hustle and bustle and all that is urgent about life. And I can promise you, life has never been more urgent and more, you know, rush than it is right now. I mean, hang on, I got one. You are connected all the time. One of the most fundamental aspects of spirituality is disconnecting from the world in order to connect to God. And you are like a red-headed stepchild if you even mention that. That is just not who we are. That is not our reality. But you know what? There's still virtue in it. Let's look at the next one. Fasting. And the idea behind fasting, I mean, you know, we're definitely not into fasting, obviously. And yet, to interrupt natural, normal patterns of life, things we always do, this normal cycle to concentrate on God, that has go back into the Old Testament, it was actually required. Why? Was like God anti-food? No. He just recognized that there's value in, breaking the pattern, breaking the mold so that you can concentrate on Him. Next one, humility. Yes, ma'am.
Before you move on, I was just going to suggest that we need to think more broadly about fasting.
Mm-hmm.
That especially in our busy lives, it's not just about food. I know with young families, many of them have made the choice to have one night a week where it's no devices.
Mm-hmm.
And just to help their children and themselves to concentrate more on God.
Yeah. Yeah, fasting's not just, carbs. Fasting is, and that's why I use the idea of cycle of life, okay? Because, and I'm thinking, some of our kids have made that choice. Hey, there's just going to be, a day a week that, we get home and all the devices go in the drawer and, we're going to talk to one another, we're going to connect, whatever. We're going to have some time with God as a family, whatever. And, but the point, and that was the point of fasting, was whatever the normal cycle is, just part of life and living, nothing more natural, normal, necessary than eating a meal at the end of the day, beginning of the day, the middle of the day. As my Canadian friend once says, you Americans eat by your watches, not by your hunger. Okay, guilty. But nonetheless, the idea that, to nurture a relationship with God, maybe there are times to not do what I would typically, normally, naturally do and devote that time to Him. Maybe there's a reason we don't talk a lot about spirituality. Yeah, maybe we don't like some of the, options. I don't know. Humility. And so here, the practice of humility is a classic manifestation, expression of spirituality. And so I'm comparing that with our normal, default human tendency to be self-seeking, self-promoting, self. I need to win, need to come out on top. I need for my thoughts to persevere. I need to win the argument. As compared to humility, where I like, I can't think who said it now. It says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So the practice of humility. And then lastly, simplicity. Interestingly, a lot of stuff has come out about simplicity in the last 10 years. There's a cool book called Celebration of Simplicity. And what really made me a fan of the book, first chapter, he said, simplicity is not simple. Our natural tendency is to kind of, let me give you a one-size-fits-all, practice of simplicity. And the guy said, no, what's simple for you is not simple at all for the next person. You got to figure out what simplicity implies in your life. So I was a fan right from that first page because I thought, okay, well, at least he recognizes that, one size doesn't fit all. And, we're not just trying to hand off a formula here. We're trying to actually create an ethic where we realize that living a simpler life might be a more fulfilling life. Because sometimes our possessions possess us instead of us possessing them. Anyhow, these are some of the, basic traditional expressions of spirituality. Silence, solitude, fasting, humility, simplicity. And then we go to the next slide and we see charity. Okay? This is kind of like King James charity, whereas in more modern translations, love never fails, all these, believes all things, hopes all things. In the King James, it was charity. And the idea is in charity, we are being not just generous, but we're being generous with a purpose. Okay? And so we're seeking and promoting the well-being of others above our own desires. Okay? Constant prayer. I think the question of constant prayer actually comes back to, how we have viewed prayer in the sense of, kind of prayer is how I let God know what I'm needing. Prayer is kind of how God gets my shopping list. Okay? As compared to, prayer is communicating to God much more than whatever it is that's on my agenda. But connecting to God so I can, among other things, relate to His agenda. And in that process, I open my life to those around me. And, if prayer to me is just about me letting God what I know, what I need, I'm going to run out of prayer issues fairly quickly because at some point I get to the end of my want list. But when I realize that prayer is as much about, the glory of God, seeking God, communicating the needs of others to God, intercession for others, all right, praise to God, and there's a whole lot more to it, then all of a sudden I have endless fodder for my prayer life. Okay? I can pray for others. I can pray, in thanksgiving to God. I can pray in supplication to God for things that, aren't on my to-do list or my want list. And that constant prayer, just connecting to God and that being a constant part of your life. Very important aspect of spirituality. How about the next one? Detachment. Who wants to share what does that imply to you? By the way, a huge theme in the New Testament, detachment. A huge ethic in the early church. Okay, y'all are going to make me look at my page. Do what? Okay, well, solitude is like, but detachment here is cutting off untoward emotions and loyalties and attraction of things of this world. Okay? So, I'm not going to be controlled by the things of this world. So Paul says, Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, don't be conformed to the ways of the world, to the things of this world. And so the huge ethic in the New Testament church was to in essence, kind of do away with those emotional ties and worldly values and ambitions and all the things that the world tell us are important. We want to cut those ties, detachment, so that our tie to God and our loyalty to God and we have space to connect with God more because we are less connected to the world. In the early church, that was a huge, huge ethic. Okay? And so they eagerly sought to alienate the world. So, I mean, you think of, verses like, come out from among them and be ye separate, of, various other verses where we are not going to be consumed with the things of this world. All that is tied into the area of detachment. And I would say, and guess what? In our world today, that's not a theme. In fact, we allow the world to dictate the terms and define our worth, maybe by the things that we possess, the houses we live in, the cars we drive, ambitions of believing people many times are no different than the ambitions of unbelievers. And maybe that detachment is part of the reason why we're just too defined by the way the world thinks and the things that are important to it. Okay, obedience, peace, peacemaking. And again, I mean, it's not like these are things we've never talked about before, but to actually see these as elements of a healthy spiritual life and essential for an actual relationship with God, because, as you well know, the world and the universe hates a vacuum. And whatever vacuum you have in your life, the world will rush in to fill it when, really that was God's space to fill. And so all of these things are kind of important aspects of what spirituality should look like. The practice of detachment, the discipline of detachment, the discipline of obedience. We typically want people to more or less obey us. As I said, we want our will to persevere, to think that I'm actually going to make it a point as a self-discipline to live a life of obedience. Okay, that's just not the way we're wired. So we're rewiring something here, and there's a spiritual benefit available as we do so. Yes?
Paul, we expect obedience from our children. And what better way to teach them than if they were to see and hear from us that we too are trying to live a life of obedience.
Yeah. I mean, imagine going home after church instead of, in all candor and love, instead of maybe roasting, the elders or whatever that decision was or whatever, and say, you know what, that's not necessarily, how I would have done it, but I certainly see where they're coming from and the need for that decision. And, we need to, lift up their arms and let them know that we are on board. As you mention that to an elder, be sure he's having a good day, that he's not overly stressed. We don't want him to have a heart attack, okay, in the moment. All right. Our next slide kind of talks about moderation as a spiritual value, a spiritual discipline. How about the next one? Community. Even at church, a lot of times we kind of come to church because, we got this vertical relationship with God, and I kind of have to do a little maintenance here on my vertical relationship with God because this is all about me and God. Okay, not so much. Okay, our faith and our relationship to the church is probably the most important thermostat, not thermometer, thermostat, sets the temperature in our spiritual life. In that, I value, I love, I treasure the relationship that we share in Christ. By the way, even when we don't agree. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I've heard it said that many times that new Christians are more likely to stay in the faith the more relationships they have in the community of the church.
Absolutely.
And I think that that community of fellowship is really important because it's to become a part of the family is really, I think, the essence of what God wants us to do.
Okay, if you didn't hear her, and for people who may be watching online, she said, you know, the I guess conventional wisdom would be that a new convert has more likelihood to remain faithful in the church the more relationships he has, the greater the sense of community. Absolutely. You know, I can tell you, having, you know, kind of, you know, gone through a school of preaching kind of scenario, what made me strong in my faith was not the knowledge that I gained, but the fact that I was surrounded by people who were committed to the Lord. And in that community that I had with them, and as we shared our dreams for the kingdom together, and as we shared, you know, our sacrifices, and if you would, the price we paid to be there. You know, one of my colleagues was a CPA, very successful. His family told him, "You are an idiot. What are you thinking?" Because he was going to leave his profession, which had made him very successful and, you know, at least at that point in his life, fairly affluent, to go and preach. And his family said, you know, that's good for somebody who doesn't have another option, but that's not you. It's Carl and Diane, right? Anyhow, how about the next one? Listening. And here the idea is listening to, discerning the presence and will of God. I mean, hey, listening to others is no small discipline in itself, and there's a lot of people who could really be blessed if they could just find someone who would listen. And so I don't want to diminish that. But the idea that, you know, a lot of times we're okay to kind of let God know where we're coming from. And the whole idea of listening for God just kind of like, not really sure what that looks like. And by the way, I'm pretty sure until you do it, you're not sure what it looks like. Poverty. You know, I mean, there are lots of people in this world who made an oath of poverty for the sake of serving God. I don't know that any of them are in our fellowship, but, you know, maybe. But, you know, the idea is that if I'm not out necessarily caught up in the rat race, then I likely have more time and maybe even some greater clarity of purpose as it relates to my spiritual life. I guarantee you in Brazil, you know, we dealt with people who were poor, lived in poverty. Their house was built over free-flowing sewer. He knows. I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt. And what I have learned from those people, I mean, some of these sweet little old ladies who couldn't rub 2 coins together in their pocket have schooled me on faith. And I'm like supposed to be the guy, right? And I can't tell you how many times, you know, well, I'll just put it, James said it right. The Lord has chosen the poor to be rich in faith. You know, when you're poor, when you're dealing in poverty, you kind of have to live the reality of God on a daily basis. The providence of God is a daily, reality in your life. And again, I'm more approaching it from the idea of clarity of life and purpose in the spiritual realm if I'm not out racing the rats. Self-denial. Unless someone takes up their cross, denies themselves, takes up their cross, and follows me, they are not worthy of me. That is the price of admission. To life in Christ. It's not the graduation. We kind of think like, I'm working on that. Okay, maybe I'm not really working on it, but at least, I acknowledge that that's out there, and it's a long-term goal, that whole self-denial thing. That's not how Jesus presented it at all. It is the price of admission. You know what I mean by that, right? You don't get to go in if you don't pay the price of admission. And so the dying to self, the self-denial, Christianity is not and I know this sounds like so bad in our culture, it's not self-affirming. Going back to my definition of humility, it's not thinking of yourself less. It's thinking less of yourself. No, excuse me. Oh, got that backwards. It's not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. And that's what self-denial is about. Okay? And when I understand that that's not the graduation ceremony, that is the commencement in the sense of this is the price of admission. And that's why it's such an expression of spirituality. When I was looking for a leader on the mission field, the very first thing I looked for was self-denial. Okay, so, he perhaps would come up with a situation, and his default position was, I will, bear the burden of that decision. I will bear the burden of that need. Instead of saying, well, somebody's got to do something. Okay, self-denial is fundamental to who we're called to be. Moderation, community, listening, poverty, self-denial. These aren't the top 10 on anybody's list. Okay? And I'm not expecting necessarily for your life, that you're going to master each of these. I just want to suggest that they ought to be a consideration. And that there's a place for these in each of our lives as we, work on, okay, I've got all the answers figured out. I've got all the formulas, all the I's dotted and crossed to a place where I am working my way toward God one day at a time, maybe one value at a time, and I recognize that all of these maybe have a role to play in it. I need to develop in all of these graces. I'm not saying that, that self-denial, that's what defines a Christian. No, it really isn't. It does and it doesn't. It's bigger than that. Okay. Then we have confession, compassion, work, meditation, and mission. Again, I just finished a book on the priesthood of believers, and I talked about a confessional church. Not confession like, maybe the Catholic Church, but the idea, basically the biblical idea, that you confess your sins one to another. Because in confession, we actually are nurturing an important ethic and belief. We are actually reaffirming the gospel. Because as I own my weakness and you own yours, we're actually telling a story not of spiritual competence, which is the story we like, but that we're owning our failures so that we all can understand and acknowledge that our hope is not that we are among the spiritually accomplished, but that God forgives sinners. Sometimes we do church in a way where we kind of all live behind masks. And we're comfortable with that, frankly, because that's easier than saying, yeah, that guy that was up there and that was a missionary for 20 years, that dude's got issues. Anyway, I'll let you know when we get that thing published. We're hoping to publish that pretty soon in both Portuguese and English. But the point I want to make, I'm not here today as our time is up. I'm just going to, kind of close out. I'm not saying that, you've got to have a doctorate in all of these. Go ahead and go to the next slide just so we get the last. Oh, okay. Lastly, gentleness, joy, kindness, goodness, and forgiveness. And I just want you to know that these 24 areas, expressions of spirituality have a place in all of our lives. And our faith will be enriched. Our fellowship will be enriched to the degree that there's some awareness, concentration, effort, giving in our lives to develop these values and ethics among brothers. Anyway, hey, next week, Dale will be back. We'll be on safer ground. Even though with Dale, I'm not sure we're ever on safer ground. You know what I'm saying? He don't mind telling you where he's coming from. But hopefully, our class the last couple days has just given you a little bit of pause to say, it's not like I didn't know that stuff, but to actually try to start putting some of that in practice and to actually, be aware and committed to those values can only bless, the body and be a blessing in my own life as I seek to bless others. Okay. Oh, by the way, and here's our other option. This is kind of our default place. Knowledge is spirituality. Okay, not so much. But anyhow, I always kind of tease people with 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, which says, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And we keep just going right down the knowledge road and acting like that's the sum of the matter, whereas Paul said quite pointedly in 1 Corinthians 13 that you can have all knowledge and understand all mysteries and have faith to move mountains, but without love, you're just a blowhard. So anyway, you heard it here first, right? That's not exactly the way Paul put it, but that's the sum of it. Listen, appreciate everyone's participation, comments. I'll let you run for the hills now. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts.